We are pleased to welcome the author Barry Shaw, whose subject is 1917 to 1948, From Palestine to the Land of Israel, which happens to coincide with the title of a book.
By sheer coincidence.
Right, now a few words about our speaker. He served in the IDF, like some of us veterans, lives in Netanya, and is the Senior Associate for Public Diplomacy at the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. The books he's published include Fighting Hamas, BDS and Anti-Semitism, which reveals the underlying Jew hatred at the heart of the global anti-Israel campaign, BDS for Idiots, which exposes the fraud of boycott, divestment and sanctions propaganda, and the ultimate aim of its directors, the stage-by-stage elimination of Medinat Israel, as well as last year's bestseller, 1917, From Palestine to the Land of Israel. His novel entitled Sarah's Story, or is it Sarah's Story, A Tale of Love and Destiny, was published in January, I believe. Barry Shaw was a co-founder of the Netanya Terror Victims Organization. He recently created a new initiative, New Zionist Voices, which gives expression to non-Jewish Israelis who are promoting our country as a model of regional peace through Israel's protection of the rights enjoyed by various minorities to practice their faith and culture in freedom and security. Copies of two of his books will be on sale after the meeting. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Barry Shaw.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for coming. 1914, 1917 are what I call the miracle years. I think as I go through the talk, I think you'll start appreciating what miracles occurred at that period when it comes to the creation of the State of Israel. I'll be talking about heroes of that time, a heroine, and some of the villains in the struggle for the land of Israel. But as we begin to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the birth of our nation, I'm going to take you back in time to the embryonic period. And in the limited time that I have, I want to take you on a kaleidoscope of a journey. So pay attention and enjoy the experience. I hope by the time you finish, you'll get a fresh perspective of how our country came about, and a new respect for maybe some of the people you may not be familiar with. I'm going to be telling you some of the stories, just to give you teasers to begin with. I'll be telling you how, for instance, one of our most revered Zionist leaders almost lost us everything. I'll be talking about two Christians that opened the door for us, and without them, the door may not have been opened. And this door was opened to us for a period of about 3 years before it was beginning to be slammed shut in our face again. Why is a Christian British Army officer buried in a Jewish cemetery here in Israel? Don't shout out the answer. I know a gentleman over there knows about it, Yankee. Why is Manchester so important in the embryonic period that led to the State of Israel? And I'll be talking a little bit about ostriches and also a Jewish heroine who hopefully will be portrayed in a Hollywood movie by the Israeli actress Gal Gadot. 1914, 1917, the miracle years without which our state may not have happened. Let me give you some background before we get on to the juicy bits. Okay? The Zionist venture began even before a man from Budapest met with the Sultan Abdul Hamid II, the ruler of the Ottoman Empire, in Constantinople. He came to Constantinople in the year 1901 with the idea of the creation of a Jewish homeland and he was ready to pay money to the Ottoman Empire so that they could buy land and continue the expansion of the Jewish enterprise over here. The Sultan replied, and that man, by the way, was Theodor Herzl. The Sultan replied to Theodor Herzl this way, that his people had won the empire by their blood and they owned it. And he told Theodor Herzl, the Jews may spend their millions. When my empire is divided, perhaps they will get Palestine for nothing. But only our corpse can be divided, and I will never consent to vivisection. But actually, the Sultan was right, because the Jews did gain Palestine when the corpse of the Ottoman Empire was defeated and divided. So he was speaking about his own fate. However, at that time, Herzl didn't think that they could get Palestine as the Jewish state, and he considered creating the Judenstaat, which was the famous pamphlet that he produced, heralding the coming of Zionism, to actually create a Jewish homeland in Africa in 1903. And this was rejected because a special commission of inquiry went there and came back and found the land completely unsuitable. Incidentally, I'm aware and honoured that I'm talking of the Jewish Historical Society of England, Israel branch. But I have to tell you that when Herzl had his first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, the British Chovevei Zion Association declined the invitation to attend. Jews, however, began to arrive in Palestine to develop the land. Most of them came to escape the Russian pogroms. They came in hope, Hatikva. It's worth making a comparison here, because the Jews always, as we know, had this dream to return to Zion. But the Arabs living in Palestine and Syria under the Ottomans for some 450 years, they had all that time to persuade the Ottomans to let them grant them a Palestinian homeland. It just didn't occur to them to do it. They thought the land was useless, barely able to maintain a tribe, never mind a nation. But what brought the Arabs to migrate from neighboring countries into Palestine was not an idea for statehood or to reclaim a lost nation. It was the burgeoning Zionist enterprise on the land and in the industry that offered them work and an opportunity to prosper. In other words, they were economic migrants. And we can see that today with the names of a lot of the Arabs who claim to be Palestinian. Al-Masri is the main tribe in Shechem. Al-Masri is Arabic, if you want to call it that, for Egyptian. Yasser Arafat's family came from Egypt. Khorani and Halabi, Syria. Sidawi and Trabowski, Lebanese. Zakawi, Jordan. Even Arakat. Some background. Prior to 1914, Palestine was a barren, barely populated backwater of southern Syria, a district of the Ottoman Empire. There were commercial centres at the ports of Haifa and Jaffa. The Jews were the majority in Jerusalem. But places like Shechem, Nazareth, Tiberias were little more than ancient crumbling villages. The Bedouin roamed the land with their goats and camels. Arabs barely scratched an existence out of the dry earth as they watched Jews from foreign countries till the land in an organized collective system of agriculture, created industry, and built homes. Now, as we approach the year 1914, major events are happening. Upheavals that will change the map of history. Pogroms are breaking out in Russian countries. Unhappy peasants take out their grievances on the Jews, some of whom escaped to Palestine to join the Zionist movement. Archduke Ferdinand is assassinated in June 1914 which led to the outbreak of World War I. A revolution took place in Turkey in 1908 when the three pashas, the young Turks as they called them then, took power and confining the Sultan to Topkapi Palace to become a mere figurehead. The three pashas decided to go to war, first against Italy, then in the Balkans, before Turkey allied with Germany in the Great War. The pasha that governed Greater Syria, including Palestine, was the cruel Jamal Pasha. Now, just as the Dreyfus trial in Paris made Theodor Herzl a Zionist, so the Kishinev pogroms forced the assimilated Zev Jabotinsky to write the following. Once in that town, under a heap of garbage, I noticed a parchment, a fragment of the Torah. I picked it up and I carefully removed the dirt. 2 words stood out, Be'eretz Nokria, in alien land. He went on, I nailed that parchment above the door of my house, for in these 2 words is told the entire story of the pogrom. He saw how Jews were defenseless against anti-Semitic violence. He trained Jewish self-defense units in communities around Russia. And his motto was, better to have a gun and not need it than need a gun and not have one. His other slogan was, Jewish youth, learn to shoot. The seeds of the future IDF could be said to have been planted there in the pogrom of Kishinev. And if you follow my thread, you will see what I mean. As a journalist and a Zionist, he found his way to Egypt to investigate the refugee camps in Egypt in which thousands of Palestinian Jews were confined. They had been deported from Palestine on the order of Jamal Pasha in December 1914, and the expulsion went on until March 1915. 2 of the people that were deported there were David Ben-Gurion, who was later to become Israel's first prime minister, and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, who was to become Israel's second president. This is an interesting story. David Ben-Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi spent many years in Saloniki and then went to Constantinople, where they went to study law. They learned Turkish perfectly. They dressed like Turks. They wore the tabush, Turkish hat. They even adopted Turkish-style moustaches. But then they returned back to Palestine when the first war broke out. I say that David Ben-Gurion almost lost us the state of Israel, because as the First World War broke out and the Turks were not only recruiting, they were conscripting any able-bodied man they can find to join the Turkish army, David Ben-Gurion recommended or suggested to Jamal Pasha that he would recruit Palestinian Jews as volunteers into the Turkish army. Now this is where I say the first miracle occurred, because the Turks were badly in need, as I said, of able-bodied men, and Jamal Pasha, in his wisdom, declined the offer. Unbelievable. Why is this impossible? Why this could have lost us the state of Israel? Because at the time, lots of moves were going on by Zionists, both from Palestine and from Britain, to have the British government adopt a letter, a declaration, the Balfour Declaration, which became British policy. I put it to you, had Jamal Pasha had accepted the offer of David Ben-Gurion, the Palestinian Jews would be fighting for the Turks and the Germans against the British, that piece of paper would have been in the scrap heap of of history, and we would never have gained the main power of that time, which was Great Britain and not America. However, in Alexandria, after Ben Gurion and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi had been deported by the Turks, Ben Gurion met Joseph Trumpeldor, a Russian war hero, a Zionist who was helping Zev Jabotinsky recruit these Palestinian Jewish refugees and training them to become soldiers, because Jabotinsky was telling him, you will be among the first fighters to help liberate our ancient land. And Ben Gurion, when he met Trumpeldor, and he was told that he and Jabotinsky were recruiting Palestinian Jews to become a fighting force for the British against the Turks, Ben Gurion was vehemently opposed to it, claiming that the Turks, with perhaps some justification, would take terrible revenge on the Jewish community in Palestine. He was wrong again. It was felt in a number of Zionist circles that the Jews also should not fight for their future homeland, let alone take sides. Palestinian Jews were ready to fight, to risk their lives, to do anything that would drive the Turks out of Palestine as an essential step to achieve a Jewish state. But there were British officials and also British assimilated Jews like Edwin Montagu, one of the highest ranking Jews in British Parliament, and even British Jewish Zionists who opposed the idea of a Jewish fighting force or to take any sides in World War I. Not only that, Montagu was a powerful voice against the notion of a Jewish state. He was an assimilated Jew, and he felt a Jewish state would create anti-Semitism even in Britain. But in Britain, for example, Chaim Weizmann was a strong supporter of Jabotinsky's Jewish Legion idea, but his colleagues in the British Zionist movement were not. Lloyd George, Britain's Prime Minister, wrote to Weizmann saying it would have the most unfortunate effect on public opinion in regard to the Jewish demands on Palestine if it turned out that they were not prepared to fight for it. Mm-hmm. Two people were, separately, banging on the doors of British officials in Whitehall, demanding that the Palestinian Jews be allowed to fight for and help the British war effort in Palestine. There were two Palestinian Jews, Zev Jabotinsky and Aaron Aronson. And with Aronson, we have our second miracle. He was raised in Zichron Yaakov. He studied, he became an agronomist, and he heard that the world of agronomy were looking for a wild wheat, a hardy wheat that could be the wheat that becomes the mass production of wheat for bread, etc. And Aaron Aronson scoured the land of Palestine and discovered this wild wheat growing on the foothills of Mount Hermon in the north. And this became the staple wheat used in mass crop production. And his fame from this discovery introduced him to influential Americans. And it brought him donors who funded his Jewish agricultural research station in Atlit near Zichron Yaakov, where he lived. And because of this venture, he built up a network of ardent young men and women who wanted to work the land and research the land and develop the land throughout Palestine with his agricultural projects. Now it's important to know that Aronson knew everything about Palestine. As I put it, he knew every curve and contour of the land like a passionate man knows the curves of his lover. He knew weather conditions. He knew how the malarial swamps caused sickness and disease and in what seasons they were at their peak. He even knew where water existed under the sands of the arid Negev desert. This was the essential information he desperately tried to offer the thick-headed British officials and the general staff in Egypt, before, in sheer frustration, he headed to London. Because just like Jabotinsky before him, knocking at the doors of the General Staff in Cairo, he went there to say, you will be fighting against the Turks in Palestine, to drive them out of Palestine and Syria. And these snobby, anti-Semitic British senior officers would look down their nose at a Russian Jew like Jabotinsky and this Palestinian Jew like Aronson and said, who are you to tell us that we will be fighting the Turks or the Germans? We haven't received any orders, we don't intend to do so. So these two Palestinian Jews knew a year or so in advance of the British that they will be marching into Palestine to take on the Turks and the Germans. So he headed for London and started banging on the doors, just like Jabotinsky did as well, of Whitehall. And about Aaron Aronson, George Kitson, a senior Foreign Office official, wrote about Aronson in an internal report. Mr. Aronson would appear to profess Zionism in its extreme form. The internal feuds in Jewry are too complicated for a mere Gentile to follow. But there is little doubt there are very highly placed Jews here who would be glad to wreck his Palestine schemes. Here you see the conflict going on between British Jews, even those trying to construct a path to a Jewish entity in Palestine, and the Palestinian Jews that were offered their services and their lives to the British. These two men, Jabotinsky and Aronson, although they moved in different paths, both stubbornly stuck to their task against all odds. But two other men came to the rescue of the people like Jabotinsky and Aronson, and Weizmann were miracle number 3. We Jews tend to think we did it all by ourselves. And I know, even today, when I'm working in Hasbara, sometimes we are required to bow our heads and acknowledge that others have been rooting for us. That we are indebted to the Christian supporters of Israel who come to our rescue when our Jewish brethren desert us or become our greatest critics. We were blessed that a door opened to us, and that door opened to us by courtesy of a Welsh Baptist and a Scottish Presbyterian. The Welsh Baptist was David Lloyd George, of Welsh stock, born in Manchester, who became Britain's Prime Minister. The Scottish Baptist was Arthur Balfour, who became the British Foreign Secretary under David Ben-Gurion's premiership. The door that... Sorry, take that back. Wrong David, completely wrong. David Lloyd George. That door remained open to us for a brief period of about 3 years when it began to shut in our face, like I said. Now, Arthur Balfour had been Prime Minister, and he had ordered Joseph Chamberlain, his colonial secretary then, to examine offering Uganda to the Zionists as a home for the Jews. And it was Chaim Weizmann who rejected it. He insisted that only Palestine with Jerusalem would become the national homeland of the Jewish people. And then when Balfour was out of office, he asked Weizmann why he had rejected Uganda, because the Jews needed desperately a home. And Weizmann said, well, why didn't you take Paris as your capital? And he said, because we had Britain, we had London. And Chaim Weizmann said to Balfour, but we had Jerusalem when London was a swamp. And with the election of Lloyd George on December the 6th, 1916, as I said, he appointed Balfour to be his foreign secretary. You have to understand that for them, these Christians, the Bible, since their childhood, they were raised, the Victorian Christian belief at the time was a traditional upbringing based on the Psalms of the Wesley brothers, John and Charles, about the return of the Jewish people to their ancient land in Zion. As Lloyd George famously said, he knew the places and the geography of the biblical battles better than he knew the names and the locations of the battlefields of the European Western Front, where so many British soldiers were being slaughtered. Eventually, Jabotinsky succeeded in persuading Lord Derby, who was the British war minister in World War I, to adopt his Jewish volunteers, despite the objection of the assimilists, people like Montagu. However, at that time, Lord Derby said they would not allow them to wear any Jewish symbols or use the name Jewish in their regiment, in order not to offend some of the people in the government. But he said he was perfectly happy to have them recruited in what they called the Zion Mule Corps, which was a team that would be taking the ammunition from the beaches up to the front line in Gallipoli, where Britain was fighting in the Dardanelles in Gallipoli. Now, at this meeting, Zev Jabotinsky objected. He said, I'm training these men to fight for Palestine, not to pull donkeys. And in Russian, a Trumpeldor said to him, be quiet. In Britain they have Camel Corps, and they belong to this with pride. Let us wear the uniform, let us conduct ourselves with distinction in the warfare, and then they will come back and give us the right to call ourselves a Jewish regiment. So they made this deal, if you want to call it that, with Lord Derby, and said, okay, go to Gallipoli, let's see how you conduct yourself over there, and if you behave with distinction, we will then consider having you into a Jewish regiment. This is where we come to miracle number 3. Another Christian Zionist, Colonel John Patterson, was brought out of shame in order to command the Zion Mule Corps, the band of British, Palestinian Jews. Okay, I'll tell you the little story. Why he was in disgrace. I'm not sure the audience to say this to, but I will. Colonel Patterson had been serving for the British in Africa. And he decided during a sort of vacation period to escort a British young lord who was on his honeymoon with his new bride on a safari around Africa. Unfortunately, throughout this safari, the young lord found his new bride in the arms of Colonel Patterson. The story goes that he went back to his tent and committed suicide. Patterson buried the young lord, continued with the safari before getting back and reporting it to the authorities, for which there was a whole uproar going on. In fact, there was a question raised in the Houses of Parliament about it, and they hurriedly shifted him out of Africa and brought him back to Whitehall to do a bit of paper pushing at that time. So he came out of that, where he was asked by General Maxwell to lead the Zion Mule Corps, these Palestinian Jews in Gallipoli. And he wrote, "It is curious that General Maxwell should have chosen me, because he knew nothing of my knowledge of Jewish history and my sympathy for the Jewish people. I never dreamt that I would become the captain of a host of the children of Israel. A Jewish unit had not been seen since the days of the Maccabees, those heroic sons of Israel who fought so valiantly and for a time so successfully to wrest Jerusalem from the Roman legions." He felt, as he said, he hadn't been asked to lead this Jewish fighting force by General Maxwell, but he'd been demanded or commanded to lead this Jewish force by God himself. After Gallipoli, there was a huge argument about the formation of the Jewish regiment, and Lord Swathling led the protest with Montagu. Colonel Patterson resigned his commission in protest. Chaim Weizmann went to Lord Milner to protest, while Zeb Jabotinsky went to meet the editor of the Times newspaper, who wrote a piece criticizing the demotion of the Jewish regiment. But Lord Derby kept his promise. The formation was officially announced in the Gazette, and the Jewish unit paraded behind Colonel Patterson through the streets of London before embarking to Egypt and joined the fight with the British Army in Palestine. The regiment moved to Palestine, had the insignia with a menorah and the word Kadima on their uniform. And Patterson was reinstated as their commander, with Jabotinsky as one of his officers. He said he was proud to lead the first Jewish army to fight in the ancient homeland of the Jews for 2,000 years. Think about it. Since we lost our home 2,000 years ago and the Romans sacked Jerusalem, there had not been an organized Jewish fight despite all the anti-Semitism across the globe, until Colonel Patterson led the Jewish regiment into Palestine in 1917. The Turks had tried to wrest the Suez Canal from the British, who had an army based in Egypt as a protectorate. And General Murray, who was the commander of British Expeditionary Forces, tried twice to capture Gaza from the Turks, and he failed both times with massive casualties. And Lloyd George decided to replace him with another general, General Allenby. And General Allenby was given instructions by his Prime Minister to give the British people a gift by capturing Jerusalem by Christmas. And just to put this into perspective, think about this. Britain was losing the war in Europe. Over 700,000 men were killed. Britain had suffered embarrassing defeat by the Turks in the Dardanelles. There was a retreat from Gallipoli in the Dardanelles, and Winston Churchill had to resign as the First Lord of the Admiralty. The British had lost an army to the Turks in Iraq at the Battle of Quds, and they had lost 2 battles at Gaza. That's a scorecard of 5-0 against the British. So what could Allenby do differently to the British generals who were bogged down in the Western Front, or that of General Murray, who he replaced? I want to give you one word about Murray. As he was based in Cairo among the senior officers who enjoyed reading the protocols of the Elders of Zion, I had assumed that he didn't have any positive image of the Jews. But I was surprised to discover that General Sir Archibald Murray wrote an article under the heading "The Future of Palestine" in the Spectator newspaper on May the 4th, 1917, that included the following: "A British Palestine must be a Jewish Palestine, and thus we are led to the idea that the Jews could go back to Canaan and establish a self-governing Jewry under the British flag." What was extraordinary about this is that Murray wrote this 6 months before the Balfour Declaration, when he was still commander of British forces in Egypt. Now for the connection between Aaron Aronson and today's Mossad or Shin Bet. I made the link between Jabotinsky and today's IDF. Now I make the connection between Aronson or the Aronsons and today's Mossad or the Shin Bet. He was known to Jamal Pasha in Palestine as an agronomist. Jamal Pasha needed him to grow the crops especially at the beginning of the First World War, when they had a lot more mouths to feed of German and Turkish officers and soldiers in Palestine. But in 1914, there was a major locust swarm that swept over the whole of Palestine, devouring everything before it. I think one of the things you'll get from my book, 1917, is a description of what was going on there. It made the plague of the locusts in Egypt almost like child's play compared with one over here. So Jamal Pasha ordered Aronson and his network of agricultural pioneers to do whatever they can to destroy this locust plague. And very shrewdly, Aronson demanded, well, we need access to everywhere in Palestine and Syria, even the military installations, because they're there as well. If you want us to do the job, we have to do it properly. And he received this. And what Aronson decided to do in wartime, because the agriculture was being wiped out, is also to try and help destroy the locust swarms, but also to do something that would effectively help defeat the Turks in Palestine. And that was to turn his network of agricultural research experts, men and women, into, in fact, intelligence agents. And he ordered them to give him reports of all the military movements, the troop movements, where the defenses were, where the entrenchments were, what armaments, where they're being stored. And he would get them to the British. In the meantime, the British didn't want to know. They didn't trust the Jews, they certainly didn't trust the Palestinian Jews, didn't know who you were. So after a couple of attempts to persuade the British General Staff in Egypt to actually recruit them and use their information, he, in frustration, cutting a long story short, decided he was going to head to Britain and again take the information and the team that he had to the British War Office. And his story of how Aronson made his way to Britain, you can find it in my book 1917, but it's such a thrilling story, him and his life, that I am now following up Sarah's story with the next book of Aaron's story. This is where we come to a special moment, because before he could leave to go to America, to Britain, he needed somebody to head his new espionage network. And he chose a guy, Absalom Feinberg, who had a romance with Sarah Aronson, Aaron's sister. Absalom Feinberg, out of frustration, decided to try and make it down to Egypt by foot in order to reach the British. Unbeknown to him, this affair of his had a sad ending because it was unrequited. And Sarah married a Jewish German businessman who was based in Constantinople, and married him and went off to Constantinople. In my story, you'll read about a very unhappy marriage, and the First World War started. She wasn't receiving any communication from her family. She was desperately worried about it. She wanted to go back and play her part for her people in Palestine. And her story on how she returned this arduous journey in which she was a witness to the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Turks is thrilling, but also desperate reading. But she knew that what the Turks were doing to the Christian Armenians, they could very well do to the Palestinian Jews. And when she arrived back She met her brother and she said, I have to play a leading role in this new espionage ring. And Aaron was going off to Britain. And Sarah Aronson became the only woman in history to lead a major espionage ring, spy network, in enemy territory in wartime. The information that you will read in this book, this is my novel. This is my debut novel. I made Sarah's story a debut novel because whenever I read the history, you read that, you know, Sarah Aronson had a love affair with Absalom Feinberg and whatever. But I felt it didn't make this woman alive. I want the reader to feel every emotion that this young woman went through. And the result of this book is that the feelers is just starting. It'll probably take about a couple of years to get any success if we reach there. I always said it had the makings of a Hollywood movie. If you read the book, you will see, as I wrote the book, I was visualizing scenes and thinking of dialogue, and I was doing it as if I was watching a movie with Gal Gadot. If you know who Gal Gadot is, she's the Israeli actress that plays Wonder Woman. She would be perfect in this role. But I'm not going to tell you the story. You're going to have to read the book. But it's an incredible story that this woman, this young, attractive woman, Sarah Aronson, led a major spy ring, the only woman ever to lead a major spy ring in warfare under the noses of the enemy. And I think, you know, for people in America and other places who these days with the Me Too movement talk about women's victimhood, instead of victimhood, you will find how women cannot be victims, but can actually in fact be heroines. And that's the story of Sarah Aronson, without giving too much away. Another coincidence of events. October the 31st, 1917, there were three major events. In a sense, disconnected, but in a sense, very much connected. On the 31st of October 1917, 12,000 Jews were evicted from Jaffa and Tel Aviv. This isn't the 1914 expulsion. This was a new one introduced by Jamal Pasha. They were ordered out of their homes at a moment's notice. Those that had carts or vehicles, they were ordered to head north. Those that didn't have vehicles were ordered to march on foot. They were ordered to march up through Palestine, into Syria, up to the northwest of Syria. Sarah Aronson knew what was the intent because she had traveled the other way. And she had seen what happens in the northwest of Syria under the Turks. It was the Armenian genocide. And they were told to march. No resting place, no shelter, no food, march north. And she, through her intelligence, was the first one to send the information via the General Staff headquarters in Cairo and up to the British in Whitehall before it became known internationally that the second genocide was on its way. The people of Jerusalem were not told, but Jamal Pasha virtually had the orders that the Jews of Jerusalem will be forced to leave Jerusalem and head east down into the Jordan Valley and then up into Syria the same way as well. But by which time there was an uproar internationally and enough pressure was being put on via the Germans, funny enough, here in Palestine, to stop Jamal Pasha taking this extra step. That was one event that happened on October the 31st. The second event that what happened on October the 31st was the British government met in order to approve the Balfour Declaration as British policy. and it was passed. Give you another little anecdote that people don't know about. Waiting anxiously in the anteroom of the Cabinet Office to find out whether the British approved the Balfour Declaration was a Palestinian Jew, Aaron Aronson. I want to read you, if I can find it quickly. Leopold Amory was the Undersecretary to the Cabinet Office, and he wrote, Aronson is a real Palestinian, having lived there since childhood and been a farmer and cultivator. If all the Jews in their own country turn out to be as sturdy fellows as he, Zionism will be justified. That's another snippet that a lot of people don't know about. I'll be talking a little bit about Balfour Declaration, but I want to come to the third event that happened on the 31st of October 1917, and that was the Battle for Beersheba, which a few months ago commemorated the 100th anniversary. Why did Allenby decide to attack Beersheba and not Gaza? Because by that time, Aaron Aronson had convinced the British that he was needed, and he was sent there and he was introduced to Allenby. And he said to Allenby, do not attack Gaza, attack Beersheba. And Allenby wanted to know why. And he said, because that's where the water is. He said, you cannot win the Palestine campaign with 100,000 troops, 10,000 horses, thousands of camels, motorized vehicles without water. And I know where the water is under the ground. There are some wells, but not enough to sustain the British army or the Allied troops. But I know where the water is. Allenby was impressed by this. And then he said, I can tell you which routes to take, because I know how you can avoid detection by the enemy and which tracks you can take without getting bogged down. I can tell you which seasons to do it is, because I can tell you the weather. I can tell you don't arrive on the Sharon Valley area during September, because that's the height of the malarial season. And he gave him the example of Richard the Lionheart, who never reached Jerusalem. Why? And Allenby wasn't so much a religious man, but he knew his Bible. He knew his Bible as a military buff, because he read up the battles and everything. And he said it was the malaria that wiped out Richard the Lionheart's troops, not the Muslims. And therefore he was beholden to Allenby. And there is a notation later on where he says that people think that, Allenby had God on his side, but he didn't. He had Aronson on his side. And so they detoured around Gaza. They had a subterfuge. Somebody before we started mentioned, who was it that mentioned Meinertzhagen?
I did.
There you go, here we go. Richard Meinertzhagen was a British intelligence officer who basically became a Zionist because of his contacts with people like Allenby, of Aronson. They wanted to trick the Germans and the Turks to think they were going to attack Gaza. So Meinertzhagen decided to head off on horseback and ride along the front lines of the Turks to be shot at by the Turks, where he dropped, almost like, call it by accident, pretended to be hit, dropped a satchel with all information and then rode off as if he had been injured. And the satchel was found by the Turks, and the intelligence was about there's going to be a build-up and they're going to do something and they're going to attack Gaza by this way. And they listened into the signals to find whether the Turks and the Germans had fallen for it. And they did. So they moved some of the troops to Gaza, and Allenby made the sweep and took the Battle of Beersheba. But the Battle of Beersheba was won by actually the Australian forces
in New Zealand, the Anzacs.
On horseback.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And the bravery of those people again we give them the honour and the credit they deserve in the book 1917, From Palestine to the Land of Israel, because 700 soldiers on horseback, armed with nothing but spears, or swords, rode across 3 miles of open land into the guns and the artillery of the Turks and the Germans. Leapt over the first rank leapt over the trenches, and then roped over the second. They had to go and stop the Turks from destroying the wells over there. But the second rank and the third rank dismounted from the horses, went into the trenches and started armed combat, armed with swords against the Turks and everything. But they won the Battle of Beersheba, which was basically the first victory won by Britain in World War I, and opened the way to what was going to happen. Of course, we know that Allenby then reached Jerusalem and then drove the Turks out of Palestine and Syria. The Balfour Declaration was a political move by Lloyd George government to use the Palestinians as Palestine, if they won it, as a buffer zone between the Syria, Lebanon, Iraq and the Suez Canal. And also a debt of gratitude that they had to give was to Chaim Weizmann, who had saved Britain from defeat, by the way, as a scientist in World War I, with his patent on synthetic acetone, used to produce explosives, which the British badly needed because they were being outgunned by the Germans. And it was his invention, his patent, that was manufactured in Manchester that basically turned the war around for Britain. Is anybody here from Manchester, by the way?
Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Me as well. Very good. I don't know if you know this, but when Balfour asked Chaim Weizmann to draft a letter which he was going to give to Lord Rothschild, Weizmann took the task up to Manchester, because Manchester was central location for British Zionism. And among the drafters were Simon Marks and Israel Seif, better known to some of you as Marks and Spencers. Although the main drafter there in Manchester was Harry Sacker. Now, when the Balfour Declaration was approved of British policy, Balfour actually signed the letter on the 2nd of November and delivered it to Lord Rothschild, who was head of British Jewry at that time. Now, when Chaim Weizmann decided to make a visit with the Zionist Commission to Palestine, Lord Rothschild had one specific request of Chaim Weizmann, who had a short time schedule and a very busy schedule at that. He told him he had to find a man called Israel Aharoni who was breeding ostriches. And Chaim Weizmann had to go out of his way to find this Israel Aharoni and find out what condition the ostriches were in. Because Lord Rothschild was an expert in ornithology, and his stately home was almost like a zoo. He had giant turtles and all sorts of exotic animals. And if you search Google, you will find pictures of Lord Rothschild riding in a carriage through the streets of London being drawn by zebras. So, this was the Zionism of Lord Rothschild. Go and find the ostriches. Now, the British, the Balfour Declaration, which is on the back of the book, allow me to read it, because now I'm coming on to a serious section of this. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with the Jewish Zionist aspiration which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view in favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing should be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I would be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Signed, Arthur Balfour. I have a question. Did the British use their best endeavours? And my answer is no. The anti-Semitism of the British General Staff. Allenby decided that the declaration not be published in Palestine lest it upset the Arab population. The Nebi Musa riots of 1920 were instigated by at least one British officer colluding with an Arab rabble-rouser by the name of Haj Amin al-Husseini. People don't know this, but Haj Amin al-Husseini, during the war, was an artillery officer in the Turkish army. In other words, for the British, he had been an enemy officer. And yet, we had the British senior officers based in Jerusalem, after Jerusalem had been liberated, cohorting with these Arab rabble-rousers who had been serving Britain's enemy. And one in particular, when you read the book, we'll find out who he is, had actually prompted and promoted Haj Amin al-Husseini and other Arab rabble-rousers to show their objection to having any Jewish control of Palestine by using the Nebi Musa festival into a riot, into a protest. What happened in the Nebi Musa festival, the Arabs that assembled there were cohorted to take up arms, if you like, against the Jews. And in the old city of Jerusalem, they had 3 days of rioting, instigated by the Jewish officer, in which Jews were killed, Jewish women were raped, and their properties torched and destroyed. Jabotinsky, who had been recently demobbed and was still in Jerusalem, implored Sir Ronald Stalls to allow him to come to the defense and bring the Jews out of the old city of Jerusalem. What the British had been doing was that they not only did not allow people in, they had kept the entrances of the old city closed to themselves. They wouldn't allow people in, and worse still, they wouldn't allow people out, i.e. the Jews that were trying to escape the riots. And in the end, as I said, Jews were killed, Jewish women were raped, properties torched, destroyed. The British afterwards went in search of Jewish weapons, and they found 3 rifles and 2 pistols. And they arrested 19 of the recently demobbed Jewish soldiers, or Palestinian soldiers. They were sentenced each to 3 years for possession of firearms. And when Jabotinsky protested that he was their leader, the British put him on trial and gave him a 15-year prison sentence. Haj Amin Husseini, who had escaped by then, in his absence, was sentenced to 10 years. And the Arab rapists got 15 years. There were international protests, and Jabotinsky was released, forced into demobilization, and deported out of Palestine. The British never allowed him to return. With typical British balance, they also pardoned the Arabs who had raped and murdered the Jews. Patterson told Weizmann when he came to visit Palestine about the anti-Semitism among the general staff. And Weizmann was loath to accept this. until he went to Ramla to meet with Allenby and discovered the protocols were being read over there by most of the British officers. I want to read you in part of Patterson's book a description which I think will give you some of the ideas of what was happening there. He says here, for instance, when he met Weizmann, although I warned Dr. Weizmann of the dangers that would follow, he was loath to believe that a British officer would be disloyal to the policy laid down by his government. The good doctor had not suffered with the Jewish battalion and did not realize the situation or the intrigues that were in the air. Within the first few months of this appointment of a new governor in Jerusalem, public anti-Zionist demonstrations were permitted throughout the land. Drums were beating and banners flying, the chanting of fanatic verses against the Jews being featured in all these displays. In Jaffa, inflammatory speeches were delivered from the steps of the military governor's office in the presence of the British officials, calling for the extermination of Zionism. Arab papers were allowed to write the most outrageous articles against the Jews, while on the other hand, if a Jewish paper dared to say the least word of protest, it was more immediately called to account. You have to realize here, this is the account not of a Jew, not of a Palestinian Jew, but of a British Christian officer. He talks about the riots. Fanatic agitators posted themselves on the balconies of the municipal building and for space of 2 hours delivered brutally inflammatory speeches against the Jews to the mob. It must be remembered these pilgrims were armed, yet no attempt was made to suppress the agitators. And immediately after the inflammatory speeches, violence began. He again gives pages of descriptions of what happened over there. And in the book, he names the names of the officers which I name in my book as well. And if you need another one, another correlation of what was taking place, I have in my book also Meinetshaken, also complained to Allenby about the anti-Semitism that was going on, that was leading to the murder of Jews. Allenby didn't do anything. I did actually. What he did, he didn't not only got Jabotinsky thrown out of Palestine, he also got Patterson thrown out of Palestine, and he also got Colonel Meinetshaken thrown out of Palestine. This was part of the anti-Semitism that was going on then. So, did the British use their best endeavours? Certainly not. I could go on about what they did even leading up to the Mandate years, but time does not allow me to do this. What I will end up on this part about with regard to the anti-Semitism was to actually quote the Peel Commission, which is the United Nations commission that were looking into perhaps a partition plan. And the Peel Commission reported here about the population. The Arab population showed a remarkable increase since 1920. Many Arab landowners had benefited from the sale of the land and the profitable investment of the purchase money. Sale of the land was to the Jews and the Zionists who were prepared to buy often worthless land for a lot of money. The Fellahin, that's the Arab peasants, are better off as a whole than they were in 1920. This Arab progress has been partly due to the import of Jewish capital into Palestine and other factors associated with the growth of the national home. In particular, the Arabs have benefited from social services that could not have been provided on the existing scale without the revenue obtained by the Jews. The British authorities restricted Jewish immigration, trying to appease the Arabs while still claiming to comply with the terms of the mandate. I'm going to end on two notes. Did anybody guess who the British Army officer is who is buried in a Jewish cemetery in Israel and why? Huh? Who?
Wingate.
No, Wingate is buried in Arlington Cemetery.
Colonel Patterson.
Huh?
Colonel Patterson in Abercorn.
Okay, good. You've been there. Let me tell you the story about Colonel Patterson, the Christian Zionist who led the first Jewish fighting force in our ancient land for 2,000 years. When he was demobilized, he went to live in America. He, of course, was a very close friend, firm friend of Jabotinsky, who, after he had been deported out of Palestine, was in America leading a Zionist movement over there. And Patterson went to help him. And he became a speaker, a Christian speaker, on behalf of the return of the Jewish people to their ancient land. And Patterson became very friendly with Jabotinsky's private main secretary, whose name was Benzion Netanyahu. When Benzion Netanyahu's first son was born, he invited Patterson, who was living in California, to be a godfather. The son was named after John Patterson and also his wife's father, Nathan. The boy's name was Jonathan. Jonathan is the famous Yoni. Yoni Netanyahu was the leader of the IDF force that went to rescue the Jewish hostages at Entebbe airport and was the only Israeli officer to fall in the action. Patterson had said to his family before he died he would have loved to have been buried alongside his Jewish soldiers. And his grandson tried every which way through the Israeli Foreign Office, through the Israeli Embassy, and eventually contacted the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who knew the story. And he invited him for a meeting. And the grandson came over and he had a meeting with Bibi. And Bibi pulled the strings that enabled John Patterson, who was buried with his wife in California, to have their remains brought over to Israel and reinterred in the Jewish cemetery at Moshav Avichai, north of Netanya, where he rests today alongside the soldiers that he led. Wow. It's a wonderful story. Now the question always remains today about, are we here because of sufferance and therefore making other people's lives miserable? I can do no better than quote this. When it is asked what it is meant by the development of the Jewish national home in Palestine, it may be answered that it is not the imposition of a Jewish nationality upon the inhabitants of Palestine as a whole, but the further development of the existing Jewish community with the assistance of Jews in other parts of the world, in order that it may become a center in which the Jewish people as a whole may take on grounds of religious and race and interest and pride. But in order that this community should have the best prospect of free development and provide a full opportunity for the Jewish people to display its capacities, it is essential that it should be known that it is in Palestine as of right and not of sufferance. Winston Churchill, British Secretary of State, June 1922. What Winston Churchill wrote then is as relevant and as true today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and good night.
Right. Would you take some questions?
Yes.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, our speaker has agreed to take a few questions. Is there anybody who would like to start the ball rolling.
If there are no questions, I would want Yankee to come over and say a few words. I want you to introduce you people, if we've got time, to meet a guest here from Ireland. Yankee.
He's going to give the vote of thanks anyway.
It's what?
He's giving the vote of thanks anyway.
Oh, I didn't know that. Are you sure?
So it was
But Yankee does absolutely brilliant things in Ireland. He is an amazing historian. He has his own books on some of the topics that I've made as well. And I just want to pay my homage of somebody who, as I told you, in my day-to-day life is in public diplomacy, hasbara, with regard to, if it were people like Yankee in Ireland and some other places as well, we need people like, and Ted Bellman. Ted over here has, if you're on the computer, you should absolutely subscribe to Ted Bellman's Israel Pundit. He produces on a daily basis, which he can send you by email, correct?
Yes.
Well worth reading the articles that he brings out. Very relevant, very important stuff. What I would ask is that you also give Ted your email address, or if have you got any cards or something you can hand out?
I don't bring a lot of cards, so maybe not.
What sort of salesman are you? This is do your work for you. Should definitely have Ted send you his daily bulletins. Well worth having. Okay,
Right.
thank you.
Well, one last chance. Anybody? Our treasurer, David.
Nothing to do with money. I have read recently the Richard Meinhardt. Can never get my tongue around that one. He's actually a bit of a con man and self-glorification, and some of these stories about him were not quite the truth.
It was absolutely true what he did with regard to help trick, if you like, the Turks and the Germans to go into what he did in the army was all authenticated and everything. He, in fact, when he objected to the anti-Semitism that was taking place here in Palestine by the British officers, he tried to get an audience, a meeting, as did Patterson, by the way, with Allenby, to report to him about it. And Allenby didn't want to meet with him at all. Allenby was very upset that these people he thought were being undisciplined, but they wasn't agreed to meet with them and to address the issues. So what Meinhardt did, he was in service here basically not as a military intelligence, but he had been sent by Whitehall, not by General Staff in Egypt. And so he complained to London about what's going on over here. And that incensed Allenby. And that's what got him removed from Palestine and sent back to London. All that part is true, but it's true afterwards. He was an ornithologist and everything, and he was stealing a lot of things from museums and whatever for his own thing. And that part, I understand, was true afterwards. He was a bit of a fraudulent character.
In actual fact, one thing of importance that Meinhardt did was to publish his Middle East diary, covering the years from 1917 onwards, in which he records for posterity some of the dreadful things that were being done by British officials. And as we all know, he was still alive in 1948, and the story goes that he got in touch with the Haganah and wanted to come out and fight. He was then a man of about, I don't know, 75 or 80. Right.
Now hold on a minute. I want to say one other thing about talking about him. I talked about Patterson, right? One of the intriguing things about Patterson was, apart from the saucy story I told you about it, he actually shot lions. He killed 2 lions because they had some lions, man-eating lions.
The man-eaters of Tsavo.
Right. Who were actually attacking and killing some of the Indian workers that were there because they were doing some construction over there. And it was actually Patterson that shot them. They actually wrote a book about it, the one that you said the name, but they also made a movie about this part of Patterson's life. And Patterson was played by Gregory Peck in this movie.
That's going back a bit.
You have a question?
Yes. Allenby, wasn't he responsible for training the Haganah, the troops, before?
No,
Wingate.
that was Ord Wingate.
That was Wingate.
Ord Wingate.
Yeah.
Who I said is buried in Arlington Cemetery, not here. Okay.
Right, I'm just throwing one other point of my own. With regard to the Beersheba campaign,
Yeah.
many people here may not have seen the film The Light Horseman, which is very well worth seeing. It's an Australian film about the mounted infantry that won the victory in Beersheba. But one of the points that that film makes, incidentally, the Meinertzhagen role is played by Anthony Andrews. One of the points it makes is the fact that it was the Turks who were dubious about accepting the Haversack ruse, and the Germans who were convinced, von Krestenstein, convinced, no, this is genuine because of the love letter that they found in it, and so on and so forth.
Yep.
And in the end, and the Turkish commander is leaving Beersheba as the British are occupying the city, and the German says to him, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm doing what any sensible person would do, getting out. God damn you to hell." Right, if there's no question.
Well, gentlemen, this statement that you read from Winston Churchill, at the time that he made it, was he in opposition?
1922, he was at that time.
No, he couldn't.
June
He
1922.
was colonial
He
secretary.
was.
Colonial secretary, he was. I think it was colonial secretary. I don't know, I'll put it here somewhere. Oh, sorry, he was Secretary of State. No, I said he was Secretary of State. Secretary of State.
Something like that.
Right. Well, if there are no more questions, I would like to ask our old friend, Yankee Backler, to give the very thanks.
You can stay for a couple of minutes. I'm just going to wind up, unless you're in a tearing hurry.
This is the famous Yankee.
Yeah, I'm Yankee and I live in Ireland. Fachle, Yankee Fachle. Before Barry tried to introduce me earlier, I made a note here what my first words would be at the end. Barry, my hero.
Who?
You!
Why?
Because I'm in awe, quite apart from your being a historian, your work in Hasbara is absolutely incredible, and this has been going on for years, and it really is doing such important work. And so just for that, even if you just come and we could see you, you deserve applause. I just want to share 2 or 3 vignettes connected with things that I've got nothing to say about Barry's presentation, because this is history and it's factual. I want to tie in just a couple of loose ends and show some of the things that he spoke about, how they link up with other things that he said. So, you mentioned Lawrence Meinertzhagen. Meinertzhagen tricked Rothschild. That's where he got into trouble. He was doing monkey business with Rothschild's orchids and birds, his ornithology, with his birds, yeah, and his butterflies. He was doing monkey business with Rothschild's butterflies, and he tried to pass them off as his, and they weren't. And he was out of the army. He was a gunner. He was a gunner. Okay. Just another quick anecdote. I wrote a book about 15 years ago called 6 Officers, most of whom we've mentioned, mainly Patterson, 2 lions, that's the
Yeah,
lions he
right,
shot,
right.
and 750 mules, which is the Zion Mule Corps.
Worth getting.
Now,
Worth getting.
through a friend in Australia, I got a request. Would I please send a copy of the book to the Netanyahu family? Why? They'd heard that I'd told the Jonathan story. So when I updated the book following the reburial of Patterson a couple of years ago in Avichail, I decided now that it's a bit more open. So I wrote to Bibi, he doesn't know me from Adam except for that book. And I said, I'm doing a new edition, would you please write a preface? And he did. And what he says in the preface is he's delighted that at last this story of Patterson, whom he describes, by the way, as the godfather of the IDF. Godfather of the IDF. Godfather, of course, he was the real godfather of Yoni. So it's a very nice way in which everything comes together. Allenby said, and Allenby was no friend of the Zionists. Allenby said of Aronson saved 30,000 British lives with his intelligence. 30,000. All those would have died had they tried to get where they wanted to get to without Aronson's intelligence, which is phenomenal. You started, your very first words were about the Zionist Congress. Has anyone here sort of seen a copy of the photo that was taken of the delegates?
Yes.
Well, we're familiar with it. Can anyone remember, describe what the men looked like in the photo? What's the first thing you see? Top hats? Absolutely. Evening dress. Who were the delegates to the first Zionist Congress? They were simple people from Russia, mainly. So where did they get top hats? Herzl felt that this photo was going to be historic, and so he hired 150 suits and top hats and put these poor Jewish peasants into these clothes. And what we see is wonderful, but it's a total distortion of reality.
He must have got one from Moscow.
When Jabotinsky and Trumpeldor were sitting with General Maxwell in Egypt, when Maxwell made this offer of, if you like, I can't let you fight for the British because basically you're wogs. Wogs are wily Oriental gentlemen. But, he said, I will allow a voluntary mule unit, which is a transport unit, which is in fact what happens. Jabotinsky said the following: Chamorim v'Yehudim ze lo holech bo'oto mishpat. I will translate, you can't put donkeys and Jews in the same sentence. I am out. And he ruled himself out, and it was in fact Trumpeldor who became Patterson's second in command for that first fighting unit. What happened when the Jewish Legion is formed? Patterson is Jabotinsky and Patterson are the people behind it. And as you said, Jabotinsky becomes the recruitment officer of this new unit. Where's Trumpeldor? So this is British thinking. Trumpeldor, some of you will know, only had one arm. He lost his arm at the Battle of Port Arthur. Thank you. So he only had one arm. He was still a brilliant soldier. So he was good enough for the Zion Mule Corps. But when it came to the Jewish Legion, the British said, no, we can't take somebody who hasn't got an arm. Yes.
So he went to Tel Hai where he got killed.
Yeah. My very last anecdote. On May the 27th, 1939, my father arrived with a Kindertransport from Berlin and was taken up that same night to Scotland, where he found himself in a farm school, a boarding school, for Kindertransport children. he asked, where am I? And they said, you're in Scotland. Oh, where in Scotland? You're on an estate of somebody called Lord Treprain. Oh, he said, that was very nice of Lord Treprain to give his land for a farm school. No, they said, you don't understand. He is the nephew of Lord Balfour. So on my father's first day in Britain, he is sitting in the same building where Balfour himself had signed the Balfour Declaration down in the basement. That very same day, and this is one of the ultimate ironies of life, of certainly of Jewish life and Zionist life, the very same day, Winston Churchill was standing up in Parliament berating the government for deciding that there was to be no more Jewish immigration into Palestine. The very same day. And he went against his government, made a passionate speech, but it didn't help. So, Barry, thank you for giving us such an incredible sweep. More people ought to know more about our beginnings. Thank you very much.
I didn't know he signed the thing up in Scotland.
Yeah, that's where he was.
Scotland? It was down in London.
No. He signed it there, and his desk from Scotland is now in Bedford.
Ladies and gentlemen.